Hello everyone, this is Norm once again. Thank you very much for joining this stream of talk and a certain value of art. If any of my nasally late winter, early spring congestion is coming through on the microphone, I do apologize. As the seasons change and the cycle of life begins anew, this is simply my body's way of saying that breathing is overrated. Okay, let's get started. Today, as you may or may not be seeing right there, I am going to be sketching Professor X from the X-Men, more or less as he appeared in the 90s X-Men cartoon. And one thing that I have learned about sketching Professor X is that if you are not a particularly skilled artist, it can become very difficult to convey in art, in a line drawing, that this averagely built bald guy that you are drawing is, in fact, a specific bald guy. Well, Marvel's designers had us covered nigh on to 60 years ago when they decided the best way to convey Professor X's superior intellect and telepathic ability was through the visual cue of wild, untamed eyebrows. No, you don't put these feral forehead caterpillars on a mental dwarf. This is only for the intellectual elite. The higher they rise, the higher the IQ. And, I mean, okay, let's be honest. He was designed in the 60s. This was prime Kirby time. It was honestly a significant show of restraint that they didn't just give him a giant brain and a omnipresent glowing dome on his head to signify his telepathic abilities. Oh, and I realize that this is a close-up shot, but in the medium frame. Obviously, having him in a wheelchair, that's probably a tip-off as well. Anyway, enough with Professor X. You'll be seeing whatever these drawings are for fairly soon. Today is a rainy day. That's probably part of why I'm fighting the congestion right now. Honestly, going to be a bit of a slog trying just to stay awake. Gray skies have, in my experience, not been terribly conducive to productivity. In my youth, I was actually very much attracted to gray days. I was never anything approaching a goth, but certainly in my teenage years, I felt that the rain channeled my inner Batman as I stood out and let it fall upon me and gazed inward at my inner angst and rebellion. Now that I am older and wiser and fatter, it mostly just makes me want to take a nap. But I would not ask you to do anything that I would not do, so for the remainder of this broadcast, I am going to try to stay awake. Okay, so today's topic is going to be console wars. And more specifically, console wars as they relate to the recent Xbox acquisitions of Bethesda and potentially Call of Duty. Now, I am no longer a young fella, and I've been around long enough to remember the first well-documented console war, which was, of course, between the Nintendo and Genesis systems. Super Nintendo, that is. The Master System was there, but nobody ever considered it a contender for the top spot. But since that time, be it Nintendo versus Sega, or Sony versus Sega, or Sony versus Nintendo, or Sony versus Xbox, the console wars have been perpetual, and they've always boiled down to more or less the same thing: buying a particular console and then finding a motivated support group dedicated to proving that you made the right decision. Rare has been the time that I have ever run into anybody who owned both consoles who had a vehement position on the superiority of one or the other. Console wars, by that token, are pretty much solely the dominion of the people least informed on the subject. And while that's not a particularly insightful take, it is an important one because most everything that I can offer regarding console wars boils down to the central idea that console wars in and of themselves are dumb as all get out. They are both a figurative and literal Twitter argument between two dumb animals not interested in resolving any conflict, but simply in bashing their heads together to see which one's brain pops out first. Now, I can see, of course, where the console wars originated. If you're a kid and you're not somehow independently rich, as most kids are not, your console of choice is pretty much going to be whichever one your parents bought for you. And unless your parents are particularly swayed by arguments that owning multiple consoles is necessary to form an objective opinion on the quality of gaming hardware, as mine most certainly were not, then that single console was going to be the console ecosystem that you were more or less married to for the next 5-6 years. So, for a large portion of the Sega or Nintendo fan base, those console loyalties were in some sense hereditary. At that point, it really didn't matter if the other console camp was doing anything interesting or not, you weren't going to be part of it. So, rather than spend a significant chunk of your childhood battling the suspicion that you've backed the wrong horse, in the cutthroat world of the middle school playground, it was often a survival tactic just to jump headfirst into full-on console jingoism. And so, yes, it's not hard to see where the concept of console wars originated. Why there was a struggle against your own inferiority complex to prove that your camp was superior. But for most individuals of that original Sega and Nintendo era, something happened that effectively ended the console wars for that generation forever. Specifically, they stopped being 12 years old. At a certain point, one of two things would generally happen. Either you'd reach an epiphany that console wars themselves were pointless, that the companies that you were fighting so hard for didn't really care much about you specifically, or even the quality of the games they were putting out so long as they cleared a profit, and you realized that your time and energy could be better spent dedicated to other pursuits. Or, as was the case with most people of this generation, you eventually got a second console. It is astounding how effective that was at ending conflict. So yeah, the console wars in general, are incredibly stupid, are unproductive, are childish, and something that most of us have had no active part in since around the age of 13. And so, yeah, for the last few decades, while I've been aware that there are still people on the internet having fights about which is better, the Sony or Microsoft ecosystems, I've really only been aware of it on about the same level as I'm aware that there are people living in Ecuador. Shout out to our friends in Ecuador. Thanks to the modern internet, which largely targets content to similar people and areas of interest, I really have not had to see any of the Xbox or PlayStation console war discourse playing out in front of me. Well, that, my friends, has changed. And the reason that it's changed is Bethesda. Now, let me tell you a little something about Bethesda. Bethesda, the parts that I'm talking about, and we are largely talking about the Maryland branch, the one responsible for Skyrim, Oblivion, Fallout, but also to a certain extent the Arcane and even id Software. While Bethesda the publisher has certainly done some kind of underhanded things in terms of microtransactions and legal disputes, the company in general in the public eye has largely been free of the kind of contentious atmosphere around companies like Activision or EA or Ubisoft, at least to some extent. I'll probably need to clarify that a little bit because they certainly have been at the subject of, again, the publisher side has been the subject of a lot of contention in relation to microtransaction, greedy practices grafted onto to existing games, legal disputes with bad optics for the company. But the types of games that they have created, the open world RPGs, the quirky arcane exploration and combat games, these have traditionally attracted a specific type of player. A player base that, not to overuse a millennial word here, but a player base that is considerably less toxic than your Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto Online player base. If I meet somebody who likes the Elder Scrolls or likes Dishonored, then I know I've got at least a little something in common with them, and compared to the general gaming populace, I'd be willing to bet about a 75% less chance that they'd shoot me from behind and then teabag my corpse. In other words, these are games that have less appeal to the 13-year-old male demographic. And that is something that I have always appreciated, not because I consider myself particularly progressive, but because I favor basically anything that reduces my need to have any kind of interactions with 13-year-old males. In point of fact, when it comes to, Elder Scrolls fans, I've found that almost evenly split between male and female players. For Fallout and Doom, obviously, these have a tendency towards more male audiences, possibly because women are more averse to decorating with intestines, no matter how deep the role-playing elements. But regardless, most Bethesda fans that I have met have been, not to generalize, but intelligent, articulate, and not actively seeking conflict. Or at least not actively giving off the vibes of the drunk, wild-eyed guy holding a knife and a bottle of wild turkey standing outside your local bar at 3 a.m., which is an archetype seen frequently among Call of Duty fans. While the Bethesda enthusiasts I know are not shy about offering criticism, particularly about Bethesda games, supporting my theory that you can't properly hate a Bethesda game until you love it, they are not by and large consumed by a need to broadcast hatred out to competing entities. Prior to the Xbox acquisition, most Bethesda discourse I saw online was largely centered on what kind of features they'd like to be seeing in Starfield, what kind of improvements can be made to the existing games, basic fan chatter. After the Xbox acquisition, that all changed. I don't know if you're on the Twitters, but Twitter has a trending tab, which prior to Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, I really don't want to be getting into the politics of what Twitter is now, but it used to be a place to show what was trending in the national consciousness, kind of a mix of general trending topics and curated news to your feed. Anyway, the newer version of the trending topic is heavily skewed to your individual interests, which isn't a good thing because most of the time when those things are, when it shows the topics, nothing's actually happening with them. There's no actual news. Prior to this, when you saw that even if it was something you were following, it would still only trend if something had happened to spike a surge in tweet activity about that subject. So it was usually tied to a specific news event. Now it largely just scrapes your feed, sees that you're interested in Starfield, and then just throws you random conversations about Starfield, which you click on because you're a moron. I'm talking about myself here. I click on it because I'm a moron. I know that there's no actual news coming, but you'd never know. It's always possible that they've announced something, but usually it is just continuing discourse about Starfield and what has happened since the Xbox acquisition, partially because there haven't been a lot of huge exclusives for Xbox recently, partially because the Activision deal has been in a kind of limbo, so there hasn't been a lot concrete to latch on there. Starfield and Bethesda games in general have been elevated almost to a mascot status in the Xbox and Sony console wars, which have been going on endlessly, but until very recently they've been going on, from my perspective, under a rock. I didn't have to deal with them. Yes, there were inane back and forths about who was going to be winning the console wars, who was going to win E3 or whatever the Summer Games Fest is now, who would win the holiday season, which company has exclusives, which do not have exclusives. These were all the moronic conversations that I did not have to look at. But now, because I am following Starfield, because I am interested in the course of Starfield, try to keep up on the news, now every day I am seeing dozens and dozens of moronic conversations about how Starfield is going to take down Spider-Man, or Spider-Man is going to take down Starfield. Like those games are in any way similar enough to be in direct competition with each other. I mean, yes, theoretically, if you're interested in either game, there could be a situation where you have to choose one or the other to play at launch and then get the other one later, simply for time or money constraints, but these games aren't even the same genre. And the truth is, the worst of it isn't even the Sony fanboys trashing Starfield, it's the amazing wave of Call of Duty bros who have risen out of nowhere, who have never played a Bethesda game, who are attempting to use Starfield as a cudgel to beat down Sony. This is not a situation where Gimli looks over and realizes that he's going to be fighting side by side with an elf. This is a situation where Bethesda fans are looking up realizing that somehow they've ended up on a battlefield, and they look to their left and it's like one of those fat beer guys who paint their flabby naked torso in team collars for football games. And he looks over at you and he gives you the thumb up, and you know just deep down in your heart, this guy is going to do something so dumb, so absolutely moronic on the battlefield that you will pray for a cannonball to end your life before anybody can photograph you. And no, I'm not saying that everybody who likes Call of Duty is like that, but if you've played Call of Duty, you know who I'm talking about. Don't pretend you don't. One of the most mind-numbing parts is watching as these people who have obviously never played a Bethesda game, who don't know why people play Bethesda games, who clearly themselves are not interested in playing Starfield, scramble desperately for anything from the press releases that they can use to rub Sony's noses in Starfield's exclusivity. Because you know deep down for these guys, Starfield has to sound like the most boring game in the world. They've got to feel like they've been put up to the task of making a commercial for their local library. Oh, you like action movies? How would you like this book about antique gunsmithing? Anyway, we are running out of time, so let's finish off this episode with a couple more interesting facts. Actually, for this one, there's really only one fact we're going to be covering, but that's okay because it has a couple of interesting mini facts built into it. Did you know in the year 897 AD, the Roman Pope Formosus was put on trial for perjury? The catch here being that Pope Formosus at the time of the trial was very, very dead. He had been dead for about 7 months, and they actually dug him back up specifically for the trial. The trial became famously known as the Cadaver Synod, and was presided over by Pope Stephen VI, informally known as the Pope who could really hold a grudge. While history does not tell us whether anyone present there had the initiative to wiggle Formosus's arms or move his jaw while speaking in a squeaky voice, it is recorded that Formosus's defense failed and he was declared guilty, his papacy declared illegitimate. Pope Stephen had Formosus's corpse stripped of its papal vestments, and in a fit of literal overkill, chopped off 3 of the fingers from Formosus's blessed hand, then had the corpse reburied in a graveyard for foreigners. Later, in a fit of even more overkill, Formosus's body was dug up again and cast into the Tiber River. Ultimately, however, there was a happy ending for Formosus's soggy corpse. In December of 897, Pope Theodore II annulled the Cadaver Synod, recovered Formosus's corpse, and had him reburied in a nicer place. It was also later ordered that you could no longer put a corpse on trial, presumably this with input from the guy who had to clean up the courtroom. Because, yuck. And okay, that is all the time we have for today. I thank you very much for making it all the way through to the end of this one. While you're here for a fun after-broadcast activity, how about hitting the subscribe button or possibly the notification icon? Also, if you would like to help us make new comics, videos, and games, you can do so by joining our Patreon at the address in the description. Until next time, I am Norm. Thanks for listening. Norm away. Like the video gamers? We have more such wonders to show you, and all you have to do is subscribe and hit the notifications button.
I mean, you don't have to.
Also consider becoming a patron by following the link to our Patreon page, where we turn your cash into videos, comics, and games using the darkest of dark magics.
But mostly just cash.